I know it's there. I've got to believe it because I see the reactions, I see the photographs, I see the critics and people who recognize it in the street.
When Audrey Hepburn faced her final days in January 1993, she did something that surprised the people closest to her. In quiet conversations and reflective moments, the legendary actress began speaking about a man who had shaped every decision she ever made. He wasn't a co-star. He wasn't either of her two husbands. He was the figure who had been absent for most of her life, yet whose absence had been more powerful than any presence could have been. In her final interviews and personal reflections, Audrey kept returning to one person, her father. And in doing so, she revealed the hidden architecture of her entire existence. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, we need to go back to where it all began. Audrey Hepburn was born in Brussels in 1929 into a world of privilege and cosmopolitan sophistication. Her father, Joseph Rustin, came from British aristocracy. Her mother, Ella van Heemstra, came from Dutch nobility. The family moved frequently between cities, London, Brussels, Arnhem, following Joseph's business interests. Young Audrey became fluent in multiple languages, absorbing the cultural refinement that would later make her feel so naturally at home in the world's most exclusive circles. By any external measure, she was the product of an enviable childhood, wealthy, cultured, groomed for elegance. But beneath that gleaming surface was a fracture that would never fully heal. In 1935, when Audrey was 6 years old, her father left. It wasn't a dramatic departure marked by arguments or clear explanations. Joseph Rustin simply became absorbed in his own pursuits, and one day decided that his family no longer fit into his vision of his life. He relocated to London, leaving his wife and daughter behind in a way that felt almost casual, as though they were belongings he no longer needed. The wound created by that departure was not something Audrey could understand as a child. She only knew that her father was gone, that he had chosen to go, and that his absence was something she would spend the rest of her life trying to make sense of. The years that followed were marked by a deep, almost physical longing. When Audrey was sent to boarding school in Kent, she watched other children reunite with their parents during holidays. She waited for her father, but he never came. He had visitation rights that he simply chose not to exercise. The message was clear, even if no one said it aloud. She was not worth coming back for. This kind of rejection, especially when it comes from the person whose approval matters most, becomes a blueprint for how someone views themselves. Audrey internalized a belief that would shape everything, that she was fundamentally unworthy of the commitment she needed most, and that she would have to earn love through achievement and compliance rather than simply deserving it. Then the war came, and everything became infinitely more complicated. When Audrey was sent to the Netherlands believing it would be safer, she found herself living under Nazi occupation at age 10. While other children were playing, she was hiding in cellars. While others experienced normal adolescence, she was carrying underground newspapers in her shoes, dancing at secret resistance meetings where no one could applaud because a single sound might give them all away. She became malnourished, anemic, and fragile, a far cry from the graceful icon she would become. During the Dutch famine of 1944, she ate tulip bulbs to survive. When liberation finally came, a UNICEF worker handed her a chocolate bar, and that small act of kindness became one of the most significant moments of her life. A stranger's compassion meant more to her than her own father's presence ever had. What psychologists have noted in studying Audrey's life is that her search for her father never really ended. Instead, it transformed. She began seeking out men who embodied the qualities she associated with him: authority, intellect, worldliness, control. These weren't conscious choices she articulated. They were patterns she fell into again and again, as though she were trying to recreate the scenario, and this time get it right. This time, the father figure would stay. This time, she would be worthy enough to keep. When Audrey met Mel Ferrer in the early 1950s, she had found exactly what she was looking for, though she didn't realize it. Ferrer was sophisticated, cultured, and commanding. He took control of her career with a confidence that felt like guidance at first. He had opinions about which roles she should take, how she should present herself. who she should associate with. A younger, less established Audrey welcomed this because it felt like protection. It felt like someone investing in her future. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, that protection turned into something more sinister. The guidance became control. The control became suffocation. For 14 years, she lived in a marriage where she was constantly deferred to him, constantly seeking his approval, constantly trying to be the version of herself that he wanted her to be. Within that marriage, she desperately wanted children. This wasn't a casual desire. It was an ache, a fundamental need to create the kind of love and stability that she herself had never experienced. When she became pregnant in 1955, she miscarried. The loss devastated her. When she became pregnant again in 1959 while filming, she fell from a horse, broke her back, and miscarried again. The double blow, the physical trauma, and the emotional loss, combined with a marriage that was slowly crushing her psychologically, took a visible toll. She finally gave birth to her son Sean in 1960, and for a brief moment, everything seemed like it might change. She stepped back from acting entirely, something almost unheard of for someone at her level of stardom, because her son mattered more to her than her career ever could. But the marriage continued to erode. The whispers about Farrer's temper, his jealousy, his infidelities grew louder. After 14 years, it ended. Audrey walked away emotionally exhausted, but also, for the first time in years, she felt something like freedom. What she didn't understand was that she hadn't really solved the underlying problem. She had simply ended one manifestation of it. By the late 1960s, at the absolute peak of her fame, Audrey made a shocking decision. She walked away from Hollywood. Studios were offering her anything she wanted. Directors were competing for her. Audiences adored her. But she chose to give it all up for one reason. She wanted to give her son Sean the childhood she never had. She wanted him to experience a normal life, away from the machinery of fame and scrutiny. It was a remarkable sacrifice, and it spoke to her deepest values. But it also reflected her ongoing pattern of seeking stability and safety through the presence of a strong male figure who could protect her and validate her choices. She met Andrea Ditti during a Mediterranean cruise. He was an Italian psychiatrist, charming and warmly present in a way that felt like a relief after the coldness of Farrer. He seemed to offer her exactly what she was looking for, a partner who could understand her psychologically, who could be present with her, who could provide the stability she craved. Within 6 months, they were married. She moved to Rome, stepped further back from public life, and tried to build the quiet existence she had described wanting so desperately. But Ditti had secrets. The affairs began early and never really stopped. They were conducted with a brazenness that made sure everyone knew about them. Audrey had left Hollywood to escape public scrutiny, only to find herself trapped in a very different kind of public humiliation, watching her husband's infidelities documented in Italian tabloids, unable to escape even in the privacy of her chosen retreat. She stayed longer than anyone expected, partly because she had another son, Luca, born in 1970, and partly because Audrey Hepburn was simply not someone who abandoned commitments easily. But eventually, even she could not endure the relentless betrayal. The marriage ended in divorce. What's crucial to understand is that both marriages, in their different ways, recreated the original wound. Both men represented the allure of a strong paternal figure who could provide direction and meaning. Both men ultimately failed her in fundamental ways. Mel Ferrer had controlled her. Andrea Ditti had betrayed her. Neither man had given her what she really needed, the unconditional acceptance she had been seeking since her father walked away when she was 6 years old. Then, in the late 1970s, after she had largely withdrawn from public life and built a quiet existence in a farmhouse in Switzerland called La Paisible, something different happened. She met Robert Wolders at a charity auction. He was a Dutch actor and businessman who had recently lost his wife to illness. Their first meeting was unremarkable. He invited her somewhere, and she declined. But the next day, she reached out. She suggested they meet for a drink. That drink turned into a conversation that lasted hours. The conversations became daily phone calls. The phone calls became something neither of them had anticipated. What made Robert Wolders different was that he didn't try to be her father. He didn't attempt to guide her or control her or mold her into a version of herself that served his needs. Instead, he offered something simpler and infinitely more powerful. He offered steadiness. He offered respect. He offered a genuine preference for the real version of her over any public persona. He was present not because he was trying to fix her or guide her, but simply because he chose to be. They never married formally, but Audrey introduced him as her husband anyway, because in every way that mattered, the commitment was complete. For over a decade, they shared La Paisible. They walked together. They gardened together. They lived in the quiet rhythms of a life built on mutual respect rather than need or fantasy. In 1988, almost by accident, Audrey found herself standing on a stage at a UNICEF concert, speaking without a script about hunger and occupation and what it meant to be a child in wartime. A senior UNICEF official offered her an ambassadorship on the spot. She accepted, and for the final years of her life, she devoted herself to traveling to some of the most difficult places on earth: Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, El Salvador, sitting with children in conditions that mirrored what she had endured in the Netherlands 50 years earlier. Wolders traveled with her on these missions. He was there not as someone managing a celebrity schedule, but as someone who simply refused to let her do the hardest parts alone. Those who accompanied them noted that Audrey approached this work with a kind of spiritual intensity, as though she were trying to repay a debt to the version of herself that had been saved by a chocolate bar after liberation. In 1992, after returning from a humanitarian trip to Somalia, she began experiencing severe abdominal pain. The diagnosis was pseudomyxoma peritoneum, a rare and aggressive cancer. The prognosis was terminal. She received the news the way she had received most difficult things in her life, with composure that others found almost unsettling. What troubled her most was not the thought of her own death, but the work she would leave unfinished. In her final months, Audrey kept returning to one subject in her conversations with those closest to her. She spoke about her father, not with bitterness, because she wasn't built for sustained bitterness, but with a kind of unresolved wondering that had never diminished across 7 decades. She had tracked him down through the Red Cross in the 1960s, living quietly in Dublin since 1939. When she finally stood in front of him, hoping for warmth or acknowledgement or some form of repair, she found a man who offered almost nothing. He was distant. He was indifferent. The reconciliation she had carried in her imagination for decades simply did not happen. And yet she had forgiven him. More than that, she had supported him financially for the rest of his life. Those who knew Audrey in her final years have said that what struck them most was not her beauty or her talent or her grace. It was her capacity for forgiveness, not the easy kind, but the kind that requires you to continue loving someone who gave you almost no reason to. She never stopped loving her father. She never stopped grieving him either. And it was this man, the one who had abandoned her at 6 years old, who had never shown up when she waited during holidays, who had greeted her reunion with indifference decades later, that Audrey Hepburn named in her final reflections as the one man she never truly got over. She died on January 20th, 1993, at home in La Paisible, surrounded by Robert Wolders, her sons, and Hubert de Givenchy, the designer who had clothed her through her most iconic years. In the end, her greatest achievement was not the elegance she projected on screen or the roles she masterfully inhabited. It was her capacity to transform personal devastation into a life devoted to healing others. She spent her final years with children in crisis, children who had lost the structures they depended on, trying to give them what she had spent her entire life searching for, the feeling of being loved, unconditionally and without reservation. That was her legacy, and that was what mattered most. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.